You develop an instant global consciousness, a people orientation, an intense dissatisfaction with the state of the world, and a compulsion to do something about it. From out there on the moon, international politics looks so petty. You want to grab a politician by the scruff of the neck and drag him 250,000 miles out and say, "Look at that, you son of a bitch."
You believe that it's maybe one of the few things that can ultimately unite everyone in the world. It shows us what's out there. It can show us how small we are.
I think the universe and a cosmic perspective has the power to achieve that end. What would we look like to aliens? They approach Earth and they see mountains, oceans, land masses, clouds, as nature intends you to see Earth. And then they get closer and they look in classroom windows and they see Earth globes in the back of the room that are color-coded. And they say, well, wonder what that's about. Oh, I know what it's about. We have demarked our landmass, our contiguous land masses, to know who your enemies are and who your friends are. This would look wholly alien to aliens. I can assure you of that. I'm guessing they would just phone home and say, there's no sign of intelligent life on Earth.
How long do you think it is until we identify organic life somewhere in the universe?
So I think in our lifetime, we'll know whether our solar system has any life. And if it does, that's just our backyard. That opens the floodgates, likelihoods that life would be common practically in any star system that we come upon. If I could live forever, I wouldn't. If knowing you're going to die gives meaning to life, then the prospect of living forever means you have a life with no meaning at all. Be ashamed to die until you've won some victory for humanity.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Neil deGrasse Tyson, the astrophysicist, planetary scientist, and author. For the last 30 years, you've dedicated your life to popularizing science in the mainstream media and are considered to be America's best-known scientist. You have served as director of the Hayden Planetarium at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City since 1996. You've been awarded 21 honorary doctorates, the Public Welfare Medal from the National Academy of Sciences, and the Distinguished Public Service Medal from NASA. Plus, asteroid 13123 Tyson is named after you. You've written 20 books, and your latest, Starry Messenger, is a wake-up call for civilization, where you explore the state of the modern world from your own unique cosmic perspective and through the rational lens of science. You believe we can address many of the issues facing the world, take accountability for our actions, and serve the greater good with a better understanding of our place in the universe. Neil, welcome back to London Real.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me. If I can make one and a half adjustments on that very flattering intro you offered me there. So one of them is, in case anyone was wondering, that asteroid with my name on it is a main belt asteroid, so its orbit does not cross Earth's orbit. There's no risk. You don't want the asteroid with your name on it to be the one that takes out the human species. Second, that the planetary scientist part of the ID there, that was on my wiki page that someone had put in. That was never true. I'm just a pure astrophysicist, and that's since been removed, duly removed. So I just want to update what you've got going there.
I appreciate that. Yeah, never trust Wikipedia. Always check it. That's for sure. You know, 9 years ago, you were actually on London Real when you were in town promoting Cosmos, which was your new series, I think on Discovery Channel. And I remember I went to a hotel room and I set up like 5 different cameras and we had an incredible conversation. And afterwards, as we took the picture, you put me in a headlock and that picture got immortalized in my TED Talk. And I actually just saw some copy that I wrote about you and I got to read it back to you because this was my first impression of you. I went, quote, Neil deGrasse Tyson is, well, a dude dressed in cowboy boots and an embroidered shirt. He represents the essence of ultra cool nerdiness. Neil trained as a wrestler in high school and soon became the self-appointed defender of the geeks. Now one could easily argue he is their de facto leader. And that's what I wrote. Do you remember wearing the embroidered?
To put some of that in context, I think a lot of kids, or at least in my generation, you read comic books with superheroes and you kind of imagine yourself as a superhero and you might wonder what kind of superhero would you be? What would be your powers? And I grew up a geek and at the time, before geeks ruled the world, which we kind of do today because we invent computers and things like that. But before that had happened, geeks were totally pummeled by bullies, right? With getting wedgied in the locker room, this sort of thing. And I was very physically able and physically fit. So I was a geek who could, if I wanted to, also kick your ass. So I imagine myself as a geek defender where, you know, if there was a geek in trouble, you'd send up digits of pi into the clouds, right? Like the bat signal. And the more digits, the more serious the offense was. And I would just come running and save the day. I imagined this in my own mind when I was a kid.
Well, I wish you'd been at my school because I was a proper science geek, Neil. And I spent many weeks at actually the San Diego Science Fair, where I went to school in San Diego, and the Science Fair in San Diego was a big deal. And I went like 3 or 4 years in a row, and then later I went to the California State Science Fair. But I was the kid that was, you know, programming Fortran when he was 13, and I loved the science lab. And you know, I actually would go to the planetarium at I think it's been renamed the Fleet Science Center at Balboa Park in San Diego. And this is must have been the late 70s, Neil. And I remember this hemisphere, I guess it was like a 180-degree piece where they would have these shows on. And when I was reading your book, Starry Messenger, you were talking about how, I think when you went to the Hayden Planetarium, you know, when you were a kid, you were like immediately transformed into another world coming from maybe New York City, and you knew you wanted to do that. I have fond memories as a child being like, it was just a pattern interrupt that nothing else did it. The cinema didn't, obviously there were no computers or internet back then. But maybe you can tell me about your experience and how powerful is it when people see what you call the original metaverse over their eyes, either out in the wild or actually in a planetarium like that. It really does change people, doesn't it?
Yeah. So in my case, it led to my career.
Yeah.
But I think every one of us, dare I assert this, but I think it's almost completely true that every one of us remembers our first time in a planetarium experience because of how immersive it is and how you know, think about it. You're more likely to remember something if multiple senses are engaged and you're completely engulfed by it. Right? Whatever it is that's happening, that will be more likely to be remembered. And planetariums do that. So I think I can assert that. And it's probably true for most people, if not everyone. For me, it was true enough where I convinced, as I've said this before, that I think the universe chose me. I was 9 years old and I didn't know what the night sky was supposed to look like. I grew up in the Bronx, New York, where there were 6 or 9 stars in the night sky. And then the planetarium dome, they dim the lights and the stars come out. And I originally thought it was a hoax, a nice hoax, but nothing real. Of course, that's not real. I would only later see the night sky in all of its majesty. And to this day, and I'm an old man now, but to this day, I go to mountaintops, the most beautiful vistas in the world to access the universe. And I look up and I see the countless stars and I say to myself, wow, that reminds me of the Hayden Planetarium. it's I don't know if that's a sad fact or a beautiful fact, but it's an evidence of how imprinted I was by that first artificially projected experience.
Yeah. Well, I remember mine distinctively. And look, I've been in London now for the last 20 years, and I think I see one star maybe on a good night, because we just don't have much of a starscape here. But I distinctly remember a trip I took to Botswana, and not expecting them. I knew I was going to see some giraffes and maybe some lions, but we were way out in the middle of nowhere. And to see the stars at night there was just like, oh my gosh, wow, this is what maybe my ancestors would look at back in the day. And
they might have even taken it for granted. That's right. Every night, they weren't distracted by HBO or, any kind of streaming services. When it got dark, it got dark. And what else could you do but look up? And look at how rich the storytelling is that lives among the stars and the constellations and the movement of the sun, moon, and planets. So the sky was our tapestry of storytelling. And for that reason, I think it goes very deep within us. There's some hypothesis. I didn't verify this with anthropologists, but it's interesting to hypothesize that humans, among all animals, were actually quite comfortable sleeping on our backs. There aren't many animals at all, certainly not mammals, that will do that. And we sleep at night. So if you are sleeping on your back at night and you happen to wake up and open your eyes, you see the night sky. A turtle goes to sleep, wakes up in night, opens its eyes, it sees the ground. So do ants, so do beetles, so do birds, And so our curiosity with the night sky may go way deeper than just some modern fascination now that we have tools to access it.
That's excellent. I've never heard of that thought and theory. That's a good point. And also, one thing I learned when I was out in Africa is that everybody's awake at night. Like the freaks come out at night, and that's when all the sounds are happening, and that's when it's dangerous there.
Yeah, not all creatures are daytime creatures.
Yeah.
One thing I want to sort of nip in the bud, there are many people who visit the southern hemisphere. They go into the outback of Australia. You were in desolate areas in Africa, and they look up and they say, oh my gosh, the sky in the southern hemisphere is so amazing. And they get jealous. And I'm saying, no, that's not how this works. 90% of the human population lives north of the equator. And most of that population lives in cities where there's light pollution and air pollution and tall buildings, and we don't have a relationship with the night sky. So now I put you into the southern hemisphere, where only 10 or 15% of our population lives, and you look up and there's no light pollution, and you think it's an inherently better sky. But it's not. All the sky is great. We've just been deprived of it, having to live in the hemisphere where most of the light-generating civilization is located.
Okay, very well said. And you believe that it's maybe one of the few things that can ultimately unite everyone in the world. Like, it's something we have in common. It's something that maybe causes primal feelings. It's something that can show us maybe what we really are. It shows us what's out there. It can show us how small we are. Is that a little bit of kind of what this book is about, or some of the thoughts in this book?
I don't know if I want to say I believe it so much that I think I guess believe that's the right word. But I think the universe and a cosmic perspective has the power to achieve that end. And why? Because when you step out of yourself and ascend, not just to get a stratospheric view, because that's the common phrasing when you want to think that way, but we can go a step further and say, what do we look like from the moon? Get a genuine cosmic perspective. And one of the tropes I invoke for the chapters of the book is, what would we look like to aliens who have no preconceived notion of who and what we are, or how we view ourselves? And they'd come upon Earth, and that maybe it's in their tourist guide. Oh, there's an Earth. It's got water and biodiversity. Let's take a look. And they go down to Earth, and they approach Earth, and they see mountains, oceans, land masses, clouds, as nature intends you to see Earth. And then they get closer and they look in classroom windows and they see Earth globes in the back of the room that are color coded. And they say, well, wonder what that's about. Oh, I know what it's about. We have demarked our landmass, our contiguous land masses, to know who your enemies are and who your friends are. Yeah, it was on the premise that, oh, this is geography. Well, no, it's the carving up of land masses that humans have done, the consequence of which, over time and over history, has been warfare, bloodshed. What side of a line in the sand do you live on? Were you born on? Who do you worship? Who do you sleep with? How reflective to sunlight is your skin color? We find all ways to divide and conquer ourselves. And this would look wholly alien to aliens. I can assure you of that. And I'm guessing they would just phone home and say, there's no sign of intelligent life on Earth.
Well, I guess even before they got close, they would probably see that, that famous picture of North and South Korea, right? Where it's like there's light on one side and there's no light on the other. And I was just looking at a map and I saw like the border of like US and Mexico. And it's just, it is quite strange to see this straight line in a world of no straight lines where there's such a difference between these two areas.
Yeah, exactly. So in a portion of the book, I identify places where at night, where you can detect boundaries between countries, because normally those are just, they're on your schoolroom globe. But yes, between North and South Korea at night, South Korea is lit with civilization, and North Korea is dark. And so there's a geopolitical boundary visible from space. There's another one visible from the daytime, which is between Israel and surrounding regions. A fascinating reality there. That boundary can be identified because Israel irrigates. There's basically desert climate throughout. Israel irrigates. Right across the border, they do not. So you see this green dust, this boundary between what is green and what is sort of dusty brown. And so, but then you look at the GDP per capita difference between across those borders there and in Korea, it's a factor of 10, right? So we have evidence of economic disparity visible from space. That's extraordinary. What's going on? Aren't we all the same species? Isn't it? And I would have thought that when COVID came around, I tweeted, I was early out of the box. March 7th, maybe? March 6th? I tweeted, the coronavirus is like an invading alien species. It doesn't care what side of those lines in the sand you were born on. It only cares that you are human. And it is an enemy of us all, and it will require invocations of the methods and tools of science to combat it, and not magical thinking. And so I keep thinking to myself, a common enemy to our entire species would be the most potent force for us to bind together to fight a common enemy. But there was the coronavirus, and that's not what happened. And I was very disappointed in us as a species about that. In fact, it seemed to divide us even more.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, we've always seen those great Hollywood movies like Independence Day where we come together when there's that alien threat. So you kind of hope that we would, but yeah, I guess we kind of didn't in that case. I've been having these conversations, Neil, for 11 years, and with some of my greatest guests on this show, after talking for 2.5 hours, they almost always come to a conclusion that you came in the book, which is this simple statement of we are all one. And it's fascinating to me. I never saw this coming when I started broadcasting. And it could be a bodybuilder, you could be a scientist, an activist, an author, or whatever. And oftentimes it comes to the end of it and they say, you know what, before I go, I just think we need to remember we're all one. And
yeah,
it's
in the chapter called Body and Mind, I explore how much effort we put in to make ourselves look different, not only from one another, but from what we might natively look like. I mean, look at what goes on. People with straight hair, will curl it. People with curly hair will straighten it. People with dark hair will lighten it. People with light hair will darken it. Your muscles aren't big enough, you go to the fitness center. Your other body parts you get surgically. And so again, what would an alien think if they see us doing this? Look at the beauty industrial complex and what power they have over what we look like to ourselves. The alien would probably say, my gosh, these humans think that they are ugly beyond repair, given how much effort they are putting in to change what they look like right when they wake up in the morning. And that's a cosmic perspective on our conduct that I think can offer some insights into, like, what are you doing and why? Have you really thought about it?
Yeah.
Or are you just part of a system with no sense of what's driving it? You're just in the masses doing what you're told by others, even if you're not conscious of it. These are outlooks. By the way, why am I an astrophysicist talking about any of that? Because that's what it looks like when you're scientifically literate. When you're scientifically literate, you step back and say, well, why is it that way? You ask questions because you're curious about the engines of what's happening and other drivers and forces, be they hidden or obvious. And so you arrive at these perspectives and these conclusions that you wouldn't otherwise see or know.
Yeah, and you could take that a step further and look at what we're doing with augmented reality and virtual reality. I mean, if you look at almost any social media platform now, sometimes there's AR built in that you don't even know about it. You know, even Zoom has, like, you know, the touch-up feature, and you find yourself, you're like, oh, I prefer Zoom over this Microsoft Team thing. And it's like, yeah, it's because, like, you're in real time, your appearance is changing. So, yeah. And I like how you keep looking at things from the perspective of aliens. I'm curious, because in the book you talk about this concept of an overview effect. And we've been fortunate to have Chris Hadfield here, who spent 200 or 300 days orbiting the Earth, taking pictures and actually tweeting them back in the day. And then Terry Virts as well. And they both mentioned that seeing the Earth from up there made them think differently. I think you open up the book with a quote from an astronaut who looked down on the Earth. What does that mean, the overview effect? Is that a bit like aliens see this, or is it a bit different?
No, it's a lesser version, actually, of what an alien would notice. So an overview effect, as it has come to be called, is the perspective that astronauts bring back to Earth for having seen Earth from orbit. And so that's an overview, all right? So that's above the stratosphere, yes. And that, however, the opening quote of the book from astronaut Edgar Mitchell, that's bigger than an overview effect, because he's commenting on what Earth looks like from the moon.
Yeah.
And there's a very big difference between low Earth orbit, where almost all astronauts who report this experience are reporting from, and the, how many is it, 12 astronauts who have been to the moon. And so Edgar, I can quote him. It's indelibly etched in my brain. It goes like this: you develop an instant global consciousness, a people orientation, an intense dissatisfaction with the state of the world, and a compulsion to do something about it. From out there on the moon, international politics looks so petty. You want to grab a politician by the scruff of the neck and drag him 250,000 miles out and say, "Look at that, you son of a bitch." It was like, whoa. Whoa.
How important were those images beaming back from that first exhibition to the moon, where you could literally see, like you said, not an overview Earth, but the Earth as like a little finger?
Yeah, your thumb could blot it out. Correct.
Right. I think at Apollo 11, in the movie that Ron Howard did, there's a point where he's actually doing that, one of the actors. and that's very different, isn't it, from being the overview? Because you see...
You can't do, and if you're orbiting Earth, you can't blot out Earth with your thumb.
Yeah.
That's correct.
It's everywhere.
You're too close. In fact, I can quantify how close they were, analogize how close you are to Earth when you are in Earth orbit. So if you, again, let's go back to our schoolroom globe, and you can ask, Well, how high is the orbiting space station and the shuttle and all the places that they've gone relative to a schoolroom globe? And they went about 3/8, about a centimeter above Earth's surface.
Okay.
That's about how high they were orbiting. When we look at they're out in space, and people ask me, you're an astrophysicist, do you want to go into space? And they mean like Earth's orbit? It's like, no, that's not far enough. Okay. I'm sorry. By the way, what's the distance from London to Glasgow, approximately?
Oh, in like miles or kilometers or?
Either, yeah.
It's like probably a 6-hour train ride. It's probably 200 miles, 240 miles, something like that.
Yeah. So that's about how, from that distance, put it vertically up, and that's how high above Earth they are.
Right.
So yes, the overview effect is important, and it is deeply moving, and astronauts have been brought to tears reflecting on this. But when you go to the moon, that's when you see Earth as this lone orb, adrift in the darkness of space, with, as Carl Sagan had said, with no hint that help is going to come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves, as he wrote so poetically in A Pale Blue Dot, his book reflecting on what it means to see Earth from a distance. Now, you asked, how did it change us? So the first images of Earth from the moon came back in 1968, Apollo 8.
Right.
And that's the famous Earthrise photo, where there's Earth on the lunar horizon. That's a flip for you right there in perspective. And for me, what matters there is, this has been said many different ways. I will repeat it here, that we journeyed to the moon to explore the moon, and we looked back over our shoulders and discovered Earth for the first time. All major legislation related to the modern environmental movement occurred while we were on the moon, while Earth was visible to us from deep space. In the United States, and I would check some other resonant countries when I looked at the historical record, the United States did much of this first. In 1970, we were going to the moon. We founded the Environmental Protection Agency, which immediately then banned lead from the environment. Right? These are things we were thinking, not just locally, clean up my stream because there's pollution. We took a step back and said, oh my gosh, we're all in this together. Earth Day, the first Earth Day was 1970. Why wasn't it 1960 or 1980? We could have had it in 1960. People were thinking about Earth then, weren't we? A little bit, okay? But no, it happened in 1970. And there's I have a whole list in the book. The list is there. The point is, you can't put a dollar value on this change in consciousness. It's like a firmware upgrade to how we see and think about the world. In the United States, there's a very famous, perhaps one of the most famous public service announcements on television, and it was an American Indian in full headdress, and he observes people throwing trash out the window in a freeway after he gets out of his canoe from a river on the side, and the trash falls at his feet, and he turns his head. The commercial's 10 seconds long, 15 seconds long. Turns his head, and there's a tear coming down his cheek.
I remember that.
Anyone around remembers that commercial.
Yeah.
When did that commercial air? 1970, 1971. At the same time. And by the way, we've been throwing trash out the window long before 1970. So one could have done that, but we didn't. Oh, by the way, that actor was an Italian-American, has Italian ancestry. Back then, you could do that, I suppose.
Yeah, right.
Portraying a Native American. But so I cannot overstate the value of the cosmic perspective as it was brought to us from the Apollo era. And all I try to do in this book is broaden the meaning of a cosmic perspective to so many other sectors in our lives.
My brother was born the day of the moon landing on the 16th of, the day that the rocket took off on the 16th of July. And when they were bringing him home from the hospital 4 days later, my parents pulled in the garage and they were listening on the radio of the moon landing, and they couldn't leave the car. They were going to miss it. So they stayed in the car and listened to the radio on the 20th of July. So yeah.
Moon baby. What's his name? Does he have a lunar name?
Eric.
Clever?
They didn't get that creative. So.
Oh, no, that's too bad.
So that was a very important moment in history that people didn't see coming. But when they saw the Earth from that perspective, it somehow maybe subconsciously changed the human species.
That's why I referenced it as a firmware upgrade.
Yeah.
You know, a firmware in the deepest level of the software, it affects everything that unfolds beyond it. And if you asked people, well, why did you start Earth Day in 19? Well, it feels like a good idea, I think. And they're probably not consciously thinking that they had just seen Earth from space. So that's why I reference it as a firmware upgrade rather than as a force that's sort of explicitly hitting people on the head. It was more subtle than that.
Yeah. It's interesting how when you travel to a different country, you learn things about yourself. And sometimes when you meditate and get out of your own immediate consciousness, you can see your own actions.
Yeah, in a fresh light. That's correct.
Yeah.
And if it's what you expected, fine. But if it's not, you've empowered yourself to do something about it, having known what the causes and effects are of those influences.
You titled the book Starry Messenger, which I guess is the English translation of Galileo's original book. And he wrote a book at the time that was scientifically correct and factual, but that went against the grain of what was culturally accepted from all the power structures, which is kind of the essence of what you're all about, I think. Let's look at the science and learn from that. Can you talk about the significance of naming that and how you see that Galileo book and what happened at that time?
Yeah, so so that we're all on the same page, around 1600, two remarkable things happened. The microscope and the compound microscope, the modern variant of a microscope, rather than just a magnifying glass, the compound microscope and the telescope were both invented within a decade of each other in the early 1600s, both by Dutch optical manufacturers. The Dutch had perfected optics long before anybody else did. So it's not a surprise that those two inventions came out of the Netherlands. So Galileo, upon hearing of this, said, that's a brilliant idea. I'll make one of these on my own. And so he made the best existing telescope in the world at the time. By the way, the name of it was not telescope. It was something called, it's some Latin, which means spyglass, which is an indication of how people were using it, all right? Yeah. It was not, I don't think it was considered a scientific a bulwark.
Isn't tech always
used? What are you doing
used
through that window?
Isn't tech always used in nefarious means? The first iteration of tech, isn't it always?
Yeah, exactly. So he invents one, and he then shows it to the Doge of Venice, and says, with this new device, he goes to the clock tower, the high tower in the plaza, in the piazza, and he shows the Doge of Venice that you can identify whether a ship in the harbor is friend or foe nearly 10 times farther away than you can with your naked eye, thereby giving you that much more time to prepare if you see that you're about to be invaded. And so the Doge ordered up, I forgot how many, a dozen telescopes, some number of telescopes where he was then financially stable. And he says, okay, this is good. Now I can look up into the universe, which is what he did. And you had to think that that was something to do. Why would you think looking at the sky with this piece of equipment would bring you any different information than your eyes would? Same with a microscope. Why aren't your eyes just seeing everything that's seeable? Why would God make you an organism without the capacity to know things that are going on right in front of you? When Antoine van Leeuwenhoek drew what he saw in pond water, The idea, what kind of audacity is that? He invents a microscope and said, gee, I'm going to look at a drop of pond water. Why would you even think to do that? That's part of the brilliance of being a brilliant scientist. The rest of us, it's just water. It's transparent. You're wasting your time. He looks in it and he sees countless, what he called animalcules, cutest word ever, prettily a-swimming in this drug. These are paramecia, amoeba, all these things. And he writes to his colleagues in London, okay, the clearinghouse for scientific discoveries, sort of freshly conceived as a place where scientists would exchange ideas. He writes and tells them, they write back and say, okay, next time, make your observations before you drink your gin and then tell us. So they didn't believe it. Why would you believe that? My gosh. Okay, so the skepticism was real, but in science, you check it out. And so, in fact, they visited him and they saw it and they can make one of their own. And oh my gosh, biology, microbiology was off to a start. With the telescope, Galileo sees that Venus has phases like the moon. He sees that Jupiter has what he calls Jovian stars. I would think that planets would have moons around them. This is not something that's not a thought. But he saw that Jupiter had these little dots of light. And as Jupiter moved against the background stars, they moved with it. So they were attached somehow. And he followed them and noticed that they orbited Jupiter. It was the first time anybody saw that Earth was not the center of all motion. Mm-hmm. And so he viewed these as messages from the stars. Starry messenger. So I was moved by that. By the way, in Latin, it's Sidereus Nuncius. I was moved by that, and I wanted to continue that tradition of seeing what other messages can we get from the universe, starry messages, now that we have the levels of the technology and knowledge and wisdom that is 400 years advanced beyond Galileo. Hence the title of the book. That's my long answer to your simple question. Starry Messenger, Cosmic Perspectives on Civilization.
That's a beautiful answer. You know, you just mentioned 10 years, you get the microscope and the telescope. And Neil, everyone's always talking about how this is the exponential growth in technology with the internet and the mobile phone and now AI, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But I mean, for that period of time, was that not equally as disruptive technology that changed the culture of the Earth?
I would say that birthed, when you combine that with the invention of the microscope telescope, with Galileo's observations, and by the way, Newton was born, within a year of Galileo dying. And so Newton rises up and by the time he's 26, he discovers laws of optics and gravity. And so this is the beginning of our rise out of magical thinking. It is the beginning of science as a tool to shape our civilization. Because around 1600, Francis Bacon as well would codify what it is to put forth the scientific method. There were versions of it earlier, but around 1600 is when it became widespread, rather than just the writings of one philosopher or another. And when it becomes widespread, and you realize what you can discover with a hypothesis and a test of that hypothesis, and you discard what doesn't work, you keep what does. That was the start. And I will assert, as I've done in many places in the exploration and discovery chapter, where if you cut into the timeline at any moment, people will be between 1600 and today, people will be saying, oh my gosh, technology has so transformed our lives. I have a book, 1898, that was a second edition of that same book written just a few years earlier. It was a book on the sun, okay? And I said, well, why is there another edition 5 years later? And I read the preface. And he says, advances in our understanding of the sun have come so far in the last 5 years, we needed a new volume. This is amazing, with new telescopes and new ideas and understand. It was like, if you only knew. But what's going on there is that there's an exponential growth of discovery. And when you're on an exponential, everybody thinks all the greatest things happened in their own lifetime or in just their most recent years that they've had the thought. Everybody will think that no matter where you cut it. I've got people saying to me, isn't it amazing to be alive to see these images from the James Webb Space Telescope? My gosh, how lucky we are. And I'm saying, that's exactly what people said when Hubble was launched.
Right.
But it's amazing to be alive. Look at it. It's what people said when the Palomar telescope was finally up and running in the late 1940s and early 1950s. The most powerful telescope in the world, getting data on stars and and gas clouds. And we understand how stars are born, live out their lives, and die from those data. Oh my gosh. In the 1920s, Hubble, the man, has the then largest telescope in the world, 1/4 the power of the Palomar one I just described. He used that telescope to show that the Milky Way was not the only galaxy in the universe, and that the universe was expanding. Oh my gosh. Oh, incidentally, that decade, we are the centennial anniversary of that decade right now, was the discovery of quantum physics, which it would take 50 years, but would transform and birth and then transform information technology for us all. So yeah, things change, and they change fast, and they change faster than most people can foresee, because most of the seers into the future are extrapolating, typically linearly extrapolating. Well, we have 5 of these today, in a few years we'll have 10 of them. Right? That's very linear thinking. They're not saying, oh, there's some other discovery that's going to come out of left field or right field somewhere else that'll completely disrupt this linear thinking. It's hard, if not impossible, to know that's coming.
Now, culturally, when Galileo writes this book, what happens?
Oh, yeah. Sorry, that was half of your question. Sorry, I got all carried away. There was an embedded religious philosophy based on literal reads of the Bible, basically the Jewish Bible, so the Old Testament, where Earth is the center of everything. It's unmoving. Everything else moves around us. And of course, if that's God's word, it's unerring, and there's no latitude for it to be adjusted, and certainly not for it to be wrong. Galileo shows this, and he had a couple of interesting retorts attributed to him. One of them is, the Bible tells you how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go. So I thought that sounds like a lyric from a rap song.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And there's another one, and I will mangle this quote, but I'll get the right sense of it. When people were concerned that he's finding things out that God had not intended or did. By the way, he was a religious man. Everyone was religious back then. So he said, he finds it, again, I'm going to mangle this quote. He said, I find it hard to believe that God would endow us with the level of intellect we have and expect us to forego its use because he's applying his brilliance to his cosmic discoveries. And he's showing, no, Earth is not the center. All right. And of course, he was put on trial and then put under house arrest, and he was ordered to recant. And the Catholic Church, I think it was 1992.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.